Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. I recently watched an English language Spanish supernatural, psychological horror movie from 2001 named The Others. This is probably one of the best horror movies of all time. Today we will explain the movie and try understanding the ending. So, let's start. The movie is set at 1945 when the Second World War had recently ended. We see a woman who wakes up from her nightmare by screaming, and her name is Grace Stewart. Grace has three house helper, Mr. Tuttle, Lydia and Mrs. Mills. Mrs. Mills and Lydia were assigned to take care of the house and Mr. Tuttle was in charge of the garden. Lydia was mute and could not speak. She was not born mute, but she lost her voice after a tragic incident. Grace tells them about the rules of the house. She strictly tells them to shut the drapes of the house all the time and all the door of the house must be locked always. If they enter a room and open a door of that room, then they must close the door of the previous room. These rules were set by Grace as she wanted to avoid the sunlights from getting inside the house. Her two kids, daughter Anne and son Nicholas, had photosensitivity, so they had to avoid sunlight at all cost. Photosensitivity is a rare condition where a person's skin becomes very sensitive to sunlight and he or she gets sunburn easily, also develops boils on their skin. In a matter of few days the condition could get serious and the person could die. Rose, she herself had migraine, so she always used to keep her house quiet. The breakfast and tells Mrs. Mills that their previous nanny disappeared suddenly, and it happened on the same day that their mother started behaving like a maniac. Nicholas denies Anne's words. Grace sees kids talking with Mrs. Mills. Grace advises Mrs. Mills to stop paying attention to kids' words and focus on their work. Mrs. Mills replies that many years back she used to work in the same house. Later we see Rose and her kids in the study. Rose was highly religious, so they discuss about Limbo and Dante. One day Grace hears a cry of a kid, but her own kids were reading books. And says that in this house there was a kid named Victor and he could be the one crying. And also says that Victor's entire family have arrived in their house. Victor's father is a pianist. Grace does not take her words seriously and warns Annie that she should not lie. But Grace finds a door of their house open. Then she scolds Mrs. Mills about it. The same night when Anne and Nicholas were about to sleep, someone opens the room's curtains. Annie says it was the Victor who did it. Nicholas also doesn't believe Anne's words. Anne also says that Victor says it is his house. And in one scene we see a hand touching Nicholas's cheek. This incident scares Nicholas and he starts crying and screaming. After listening to her kids scream, Rose goes to her kids' room and she punishes Anne. She believes that Anne was telling Nicholas some stories and he was getting scared because of her stories. Next day Grace hears some footsteps and she thinks it's the footsteps of Lydia. But Lydia and Mrs. Mills were outside the house. Grace could sense the presence of other being apart from her family. Grace could hear 3 more footsteps in her house. And says that she had seen some people going to their junk room. Rose goes straight to the junk room to check, but she could hear someone whispering, "She is here, she is watching us." Grace gets petrified and starts panicking, and suddenly the door of the room opens in its own. Grace rushes outside the room and finds Anne. And says that she had seen 3 people coming out of the room. And says that this house is theirs and they are saying that they will remove all the curtains from the house. And draws a sketch and says that the new family has a father, mother and a son named Victor. Besides them, a scary old lady also lives in their house and sometimes she talks with Anne. Grace was scared to her core and she asks the servants to check the entire house. She also takes a gun and inspects the entire house. We can see that Grace get déjà vu while holding the gun. While inspecting the house, Grace finds a book called Book of Death from 19th century which had pictures of the people who were dead. People used to do it in ancient times as they used to believe that the dead person could stay alive forever with the help of these books. Grace removes the Book of the Dead and went on searching the entire house. She could not find anything, so she asks Mrs. Mills about the house. Mrs. Mills says that there were 15 servants in the house, but the owners of the house left the house, so only they were left. This happened as tuberculosis was widespread in the area and they lost their lives. So they also had to leave the place and they returned to the house after many years. Grace also tell her about her life. Her husband fought in Second World War. The war was over but her husband did not return. She says that she still believes that he is alive. Grace heard a sound of the piano when she was in her room. She then goes to music room and locks the piano. Suddenly the door of the room shuts in front of her face. Piano also gets unlocked on its own. After this Grace also believes that there's someone living with them. Mrs. Mills says that sometimes world of living and world of dead gets connected. These things happen because of it. But Grace refuses to believe it. Grace goes to find a priest. While leaving she sees Mr. Tuttle. She asks him to look for Victor and his family's grave. She believes that they are living in the house as this was their old house. We see Mr. Tuttle and Mrs. Mills talking to each other. Mrs. Mills says that Grace will realize the truth in the right time. Mrs. Mills asks Mr. Tuttle to uncover the grave. After this scene we can understand that these three people know about all the weird things going inside the house. Mrs. Mills also says that Grace wouldn't go far as the area surrounding the house is foggy. We see Grace ignoring the fog and walking away from the house. From the fog she sees a man approaching her. It was her husband Charles. And he was in war's uniform. Grace brings Charles home and kids were happy to see their father too. Charles seemed lost in his own thoughts and he could not eat and drink properly. Grace was happy about all this and she forgets the weird things happening inside the house. And reminds Grace about an unknown family living in their house. Grace then gets annoyed and starts fighting with Anne. And starts breathing heavily and Grace asks Anne to stop doing it. After sometimes Grace dresses and in a beautiful wedding gown but she sees an old woman in the dress. The old woman was talking in Anne's voice. Grace then attacks the old woman but it was not the old woman but it was her daughter Anne. Anne yells in pain and calls her mom wicked. And tells Nicholas that her mother is going mad just like that day. But Nicholas has no memory of that day. Charles says that he wants to go back to the war front but the war was over. His words makes Grace upset. They sleep together that night but Charles leaves the house in the morning without telling anyone. Grace was more upset and she could hear her kids scream. Grace rushes to her kids' room and someone had opened all the curtains of their house. Grace then wraps her kids in a blanket and tries protecting her kid from sunlight. She then uses a board to block the light. Mrs. Mills behaves normally throughout the situation and looked unfazed. Mr. Tuttle says that maybe the kids have recovered from the illness. Grace now believes that the curtains were opened by the servants. She fires them from their job and makes them leave the house. That night Anne and Nicholas go searching for their father. Outside they find 3 graves with Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle and Lydia written on it. The 3 servants were dead since 1891. The kids then see the 3 servants in front of them. The kids then run towards their house. Grace then finds the Book of Dead and finds the pictures of the 3 servants in it. Grace then tries shooting the servants, but nothing happens to them. She then shuts the front gate door on them. Mrs. Mills then tells her that they too had died from tuberculosis. She even says that Grace should learn to live with the dead. She says that the curtains were removed by Victor's family and it wasn't them. The kids then rush upstairs to a room and they both hide. Nicholas then starts breathing heavily. Then we see an old woman who finds Anne and Nicholas. Grace comes to rescue her children but she sees they were sitting together with the family. Here we find the biggest plot twist of the movie. We get to know that the old woman was a medium. She used to talk with and through Sant's method. This method is used by the ghost to communicate. And there we discover that Anne, Nicholas, Grace were not alive either. But they had no idea that they were dead. During the process Anne says that their father never returned from the war. Because of the frustration Rose smothered her kids from a pillow and killed them. Grace then shot herself. From then their ghost was in the house like they were living. Anne and Nicholas were now a ghost so they don't have photosensitivity. Victor and his family were actually alive and were haunted by Grace, Anne and Nicholas. Grace and her kids scream that they aren't dead and they start destroying the things on the table. In reality, we see Victor and his family sitting in the table and an invisible force moving the things around and destroying it. Next day, Victor and his family leaves the house so that Grace and her family could live in the house. Victor was also having nightmares. Mrs. Mills says that Lydia lost her voice the moment she realized that she was dead. She even says that many time livings and dead reside together and they haunt each other. In the last scene, we seen Grace and other ghosts living together in the house. This house was on sale again. So it means that some other family will again come to live with them. So the movie ends. We can conclude that Grace has gone insane as she lost her husband to the war. She then killed her own kids and killed herself. After killing the family, the servants must have left the house. And keeps on repeating, that day, the word signifying the day Grace killed her children. We also remember a scene where Grace gets a déjà vu while picking up her gun, so it must be the same gun that she used to kill herself. And was seen breathing heavily and must have done the same while she was smothered by her mother, so Grace tells her not to do it. In the last scene, Nicholas also does the same, so it could mean that he too remembers being smothered by Grace. This is the story of one of the classic horror movie. The others, we explain such movies in this channel, so like, share and subscribe for such contents. Thank you for watching.